Vamos lá.
Oi, pessoal. Boa tarde a todas, boa tarde a todos. Sejam muito bem-vindas, muito bem-vindos a essa sessão Keynote do 11º Seminário de Proteção à Privacidade e Dados Pessoais. Sessão aí toda realizada, seminário aí todo realizado via internet, aí por causa da pandemia, mas sejam todos bem-vindos. Eu sou Rafael Evangelista, sou pesquisador da Unicamp e sou conselheiro pelo setor acadêmico do CGI.br. O nosso painelista hoje, nessa sessão, vai ser o professor Colin Bennett, da Universidade de Vitória, do Canadá, e a sessão tem o título Eleições baseadas em dados e micro-segmentação de eleitores, as principais questões para os defensores da privacidade. Eu penso que essa vai ser uma sessão muito rica, muito importante, porque, entre outros motivos, cruza dois temas que são muito importantes e que são especialidade do professor Bennett: a defesa da privacidade e o emergente tema das eleições baseadas em dados. O professor Bennett tem um trabalho pioneiro em defesa do conceito de privacidade, que considero importantíssimo porque dá justamente o caráter político necessário para esse conceito. Sem deixar de levar em consideração as críticas pertinentes e necessárias à ideia de privacidade, ele já em 2011 nos apontava que iríamos ter que aprender a conviver com essa categoria, que ganha relevância no contexto de uma sociedade de vigilância. E é impressionante como a privacidade, mesmo em países com uma tradição legal e cultural diferente da anglo-saxã ou da ocidental, como o Brasil, foi se estabelecendo como uma categoria, a privacidade foi se estabelecendo como uma categoria organizadora de um conjunto de direitos e na resistência a violações que estão postas hoje na atualidade. E é pelo refinamento do debate em torno dessa categoria que tem se dado importantes avanços na legislação, na regulação de políticas públicas e iniciativas privadas e na proteção de direitos. A defesa da privacidade ganha muita relevância nesse nosso contexto de crescentes assimetrias de poder derivadas dessa gestão das pessoas via dados, né? E esse debate se casa perfeitamente com os desafios que nós temos agora com relação aos sistemas eleitorais e as campanhas eleitorais, que são agora, em grande parte, movidas a dados. Eu estive no início do ano passado, em Vitória, onde o professor Bennett dá aula, num workshop que foi fantástico, comandado pelo professor Bennett e pelo professor David Lyon, e pude acompanhar um grande panorama europeu e norte-americano sobre as chamadas data-driven elections. E acho que uma interlocução internacional tem muito a contribuir para esse nosso contexto brasileiro. No Brasil, infelizmente, a gente tem esse costume de normalizar certas situações de violações de direitos, e infelizmente isso tem valido também para o sistema eleitoral. E esse é de fato um panorama político, estrutural, em constante mudança, e que traz desafios não só legislativos, mas da aplicação das leis. Se adotar medidas que sejam proporcionais, que possam punir quem infringe a lei, mas sem retirar a legitimidade das escolhas dos eleitores. Então, nós temos aí desafios muito importantes pela frente, que num primeiro momento podem parecer que são teóricos, né, que num primeiro momento são desafios teóricos, que se dão na discussão sobre o grau de autonomia e liberdade que os sujeitos têm hoje frente ao grande conjunto de fatores de influência e tentativas de modificação de comportamento a que estamos submetidos nesses sistemas digitais, e ainda muito mais num contexto como o nosso, não é? O da pandemia. Mas não vou me alongar aqui, quem vai falar com vocês hoje é o professor Bennett. Queria fazer uma introdução a ele, que é também um bom amigo. O Colin Bennett recebeu seu bacharelado e mestrado pela Universidade de Wales, e seu PhD pela Universidade de Illinois, em Urbana-Champaign. Desde 1986, ele leciona no Departamento de Ciência Política da Universidade de Vitória, onde agora é professor. Cidade belíssima, Vitória. e ele tem recebido cargos de professor visitante na Kennedy School of Government de Harvard, no Centro de Estudos de Direito e Sociedade na Universidade da Califórnia, em Berkeley, a Escola de Direito da Universidade de New South Wales, o Centro de Direito, Ciência, Tecnologia e Sociedade da Vrije University em Bruxelas e na Faculdade de Informação da Universidade de Toronto. Sua pesquisa tem se concentrado na análise comparativa de tecnologias de vigilância e políticas de proteção de privacidade nos níveis doméstico e internacional. Além de vários artigos acadêmicos e de jornais, ele escreveu ou editou 7 livros, incluindo The Governance of Privacy, com Charles Rabb, The Privacy Advocates, Resisting the Spread of Surveillance, Jogando o Cartão de Identidade, Vigilância, Segurança e Identificação em Perspectiva Global, coeditado com David Lyon, e Security Games, Surveillance and Control at Mega Events, coeditado com Kevin Haggerty. Ele completou relatórios de políticas sobre privacidade e de proteção de dados para o governo canadense, a Canadian Standards Association, o Privacy Commissioner of Canada, a Comissão Europeia, Comissário de Informação do Reino Unido, entre outros. Ele foi co-investigador de uma grande iniciativa de pesquisa colaborativa intitulada A Nova Transparência, Vigilância e Seleção Social, que culminou no relatório de 2016, Transparent Lives, Surveillance in Canada, por meio de uma SSHRC Partnership Grant sobre Big Data Surveillance e um novo SSHRC Insight Grant. Ele está atualmente pesquisando a política comparativa de eleições baseadas em dados e a captura e uso de informações pessoais por partidos políticos e candidatos nas democracias ocidentais. Bom, temos então agora primeiro a fala do professor Bennett. Na seguida, vocês podem já ir mandando questões pelo chat. Nós vamos ter depois uns 20 minutinhos aí para o professor conversar com vocês, e daí nós faremos o nosso encerramento. De novo, sejam muito bem-vindos, e eu passo a palavra para o professor Colin Bennett.
Okay, thank you, Raphael. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I hope everybody can see that, and good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank very much the Brazilian Network Information Center, the Internet Steering Committee, for this invitation. I also want to say that I have, over the years, been interacting a lot with Professor Danilo Doneda. I don't know whether he's on the call now, but working on the Brazilian Data Protection Act, and also with the Association for Data Privacy in Brazil, and Rafael Zanata. So I know a little bit about Brazilian privacy issues and the concerns you have in Brazil, although most of my talk is going to be focused on North America. I must say I would really love to be in Brazil right now. It is cold and raining outside, and it would just be absolutely excellent to be with you. But it is what it is, as they say. Thank you, Raphael, for that very kind introduction. For those of you who need some geography, this is where I live, Victoria, British Columbia, just in the Pacific Northwest. We are famous for a number of things here. We're famous because we're the capital of British Columbia. We have a beautiful legislature. We have some beautiful gardens, and we have some beautiful wildlife, including orcas and killer whales, if anybody who's been up here. But we are also famous for some of the key actors in the drama and the issue that brought the whole question about data-driven elections and micro-targeting to global attention. For a while, Mr. Christopher Wiley, the whistleblower in the Cambridge Analytica scandal lived in British Columbia. The company that collaborated with Cambridge Analytica in targeting ads in different countries, including Britain and the United States, a company called Aggregate IQ, was closely associated with that entire scandal. And the person that I think has been responsible more than anybody else amongst regulators for investigating the use of data in political campaigns is Elizabeth Denham, the current Information Commissioner in the United Kingdom, who before that was the Privacy and Information Commissioner in British Columbia. So we have a very, very close association with the problems here as well as the solutions. And that has been an extraordinary opportunity for me to talk with some of the central actors in these scandals and to critically think about what the issues are, but more importantly, what is the appropriate balance between the privacy of voters and the rights and duties of political actors and political parties to engage the electorate. So what I would like to do in the next 40 minutes or so is talk about, in a very general sense, 5 separate issues. The notion of voter surveillance. Raphael mentioned that we are part of a surveillance studies network globally, which looks at the way that personal data is captured. And I want to say something about surveillance's effect on democracy and democratic practice. I'd like to say something very generally about the trends in data-driven elections with a few examples of what we've seen in the recent election in the United States, just a few indications of where the technology is going. I'd like to say something comparatively about the different factors around the world, not just technology, that might enable political micro-targeting. The challenges, therefore, for the protection of privacy in the electoral context. And then finally, I want this talk most generally to be directed towards what I will call privacy advocates. Those people who are concerned about the protection of personal information, both from a civil society point of view, as well as from a regulatory point of view, and to think more critically about how privacy advocates, I wrote a book of that title, can collaborate and challenge in our respective societies and globally the worst effects of data-driven elections. Raphael kindly mentioned the conference that we had here in April 2019. It was a terrific experience for me to see some of the major scholars in the world talk about these issues. We edited the papers from that collection in an issue of the Internet Policy Review that was published at the beginning of this year. And Raphael is a very modest man, but he didn't mention that he too has an article in that piece with Fernando Bruno on the use of WhatsApp and targeted messages in the previous Bolsonaro campaign in your Brazilian election of 2018. So I commend that as well as the entire collection to you, because I think the research there summarized nicely many of the things that I want to say in this talk. I have been giving a lot of thought in my work to the way that privacy, the way that the protection of personal data contributes to different forms of democracy. And there's a large literature on this. There's a rich tradition of trying to understand the role that effective privacy plays within our democratic practice. We're used to the secret ballot now, globally. That is a practice. But privacy plays deeper roles. It advances individual autonomy, self-fulfillment. It reinforces political competition for liberal democracy. It bolsters our participation and engagement. If we have a guarantee of privacy, we can be assured that we might vote more freely. We may speak out more freely. anonymously perhaps. We can engage in interest groups. We can sign petitions. We can participate in civil society activism and protesting. And therefore, the ability to control the information about one's political participation, about how one participates, when one participates, is supported by the right to control the information about yourself, privacy. It also enhances our freedom to make choices under conditions of reflection, equal respect for the preferences, values, and interests of others. There's a very large literature on that subject going back many, many, many years. So we know that privacy, the protection of personal information, the absence of excessive surveillance in elections is important for democracy. But until recently, and really until these scandals hit the global news, we have known relatively little about how privacy has been compromised by democracy and by the agents that seek to mobilize, engage us and encourage us to vote or not to vote, by political parties, by candidates, and by the organizations that work for them. You have to look very closely in the literature up until about 5 or 6 years ago for any real reference about how personal information is compromised by democratic practice. And that has, of course, changed with the global attention now to these issues. Voter surveillance, therefore, the surveillance of voters, has different effects on democratic practice. And we're coming to see now what those effects might be. And you see these issues discussed in both the popular media as well as in the academic literature. There are profound concerns about divisiveness. If data drives elections, does that then produce a tendency to deliver messages on very precise issues, very focused issues, sometimes in English called wedge issues? Do they produce filter bubbles, echo chambers, when individuals only see a subset of the information that is algorithmically curated according to their presumed and prior interests and behaviors? Does it therefore reinforce partisanship, the fragmentation of the political space? Does it therefore have an effect on what we talk about as the marketplace of ideas, democratic discourse? When advertising cannot be countered in real time, what effect does that happen? In the open, false claims can be challenged. In secret, they may stand unchallenged. And that secrecy of much of contemporary political messaging on social media but elsewhere bars or constrains the self-correcting benefits of rights of freedom of expression and freedom of speech. There are concerns about political participation. If we can precisely segment or divide up the electorate into those people that politicians need to campaign to and for, and ultimately care about after the election, are others ignored? Are others marginalized? Is it only those people who are getting the precise messages from campaigns, those that are going to be governed for? Does it contribute to a decline in political participation as voters perceive that their interests are being manipulated by political and technical elites? There are questions about campaigning. Do data-driven elections reinforce the permanent campaigns where parties have the capacity to make voter contact not only during official campaigns, but over the course of the entire government cycle? Campaigning becomes an enduring enterprise, something that just happens all the time, before, during, and after the official campaign period. Do they discourage volunteering for political parties? Does the effect of data on elections means that there's fewer people who are going to want to engage within classic political parties? Does it erode face-to-face contact? In many societies, voter canvassing on the door is part of the political culture. It is in Canada, it is in the United States, at least before the pandemic. But is the emphasis on personal data, does it erode that kind of tradition? Do data-driven elections favor larger and more established parties, which have the resources to employ the technical constraints that manage data and coordinate messaging? And what effects does it have on governance? Does it produce a kind of patron-client politics, where there's so much data that's known about your supporters that it's only those people who are being satisfied and only those people who are being governed to after the election? There's a whole range of questions there about voter surveillance and democracy that we're trying to get our minds around. The effects of these practices are going to differ from democracy to democracy. But the questions about the legitimate processing of personal data on the electorate is at the heart of the answer to these larger questions. The conduct of voter analytics and the micro-targeting of precise messages, including fake news, has a direct relationship to advertising and to the algorithms that target individual citizens, often without their knowledge and consent. So familiar questions about privacy and are now injected into this heated international debate about democratic practices, and our regulators and those people who are interested in studying privacy are now at the heart of a global conversation about the future of democracy. I'd like to just commend to you an excellent report by a group in Germany called the Tactical Tech Collective. They have been monitoring data-driven elections around the world, including in Brazil, looking at the complex campaign ecosystem. And they have noted that the entry of commercial behavioral marketing techniques into the world of political campaigning has produced a large political influence industry, whereas personal data is regarded as a personal asset used through databases, often called voter relationship management systems. Personal data is seen as political intelligence through the constant testing and experimenting of what messages work. And personal data is seen as political influencing, where mass messaging then leads to the micro-targeting of messages to ever more precise groups of voters. I commend that report to you. And here's a few examples of the things that we've seen in the United States. So I'll just concentrate on the United States for now, because I think a lot of these techniques are invented in the United States and then exported to other countries, where there's a massive accumulation of personal data on political affiliation, close alliances between data brokers, digital advertising firms, and political parties. We've seen that trend for 20 years or more. Sophisticated personalization techniques using behavioral data that is generated online through social media platforms, artificial intelligence, machine learning to produce highly granular ad campaigns. Although I would note that the notion of a political advertisement online is very different from that of one on television. Ad campaigns online through social media are more of a process rather than a discrete event. And particularly the use of geospatial, mobile, and geo-targeting strategies to determine what voters are in what places at what time. Those are some of the contemporary trends in the United States. My colleague Jeff Chester from the Center for Digital Rights in Center for Digital Democracy in the United States has been writing about that, and he too has an article on those issues in the journal that I mentioned to you. So here's an example. This is a national database. It's a company called Catalyst. I could have given a number of other examples. This is a database. This is a company that operates on the more progressive side of the political spectrum, and has been working with the Democratic candidates for many, many years. And they now say on their website that they have 240 million plus records on unique voting age individuals, registered voters, unregistered voting age persons, about cell phones, about ballots casts, and what they're able to do through the public information in the United States on registered voting is to consolidate or amalgamate that data with data that comes from a whole variety of different sources to produce highly detailed profiles on the American electorate. That's just one example. You're familiar with Cambridge Analytica. This is the company that pushed this whole issue to the global attention. And at one point, they were claiming that they had 5,000 data points per person on over 220 million Americans. That is an exaggeration. It's a myth. There's a lot of hype in this world, but nevertheless, it demonstrates, just the extent of personal data that is collected and that can be inferred on the political preferences of Americans. And we saw just a few weeks ago, and I commend this to you, a channel for news broadcast, which was about the use of these data sets and by the Republican Party in states like Wisconsin. And they were able to demonstrate quite clearly how voters were categorized, Democratic voters were categorized, including some voters who were categorized as deterrent. These people should be deterred from voting. And therefore, in identifying those voters, they were able to target messages to them, in this case, particularly African-American voters in cities like Milwaukee, discouraging them from voting for Hillary Clinton in 2016. And then, claiming that that indeed had a profound effect on the outcome of the 2016 election. So the story about Cambridge Analytica continues to reverberate through the global news. In 2020, we've also seen a number of stories about the use of mobile applications to collect huge amounts of voter data. And there's one particularly that caught my eye, and I think it gives you a sign of the sort of practices that are available. This was a story that was published earlier this year about the Trump campaign targeting Catholic voters using cell phone technology, and particularly through the practice of geofencing. That targets people based on their location. So when you agree to the app that you download from the Trump campaign, you're agreeing to share your location data. And geofencers are then able to capture that when you enter or leave a geographically prescribed area. And in this particular case, a church. So Catholic organizations for pro-Trump were capturing this data and then capturing the IP addresses that these voters were giving up, these churchgoers were giving up when they attended Mass. And then they were able to target ads directly to their devices and cross-reference those data with other that they had on that voter from other forms of data that I just explained. This was just one of the stories that hit the headlines. And of course, a lot of people felt that this was entirely intrusive, that the technology was intruding on a highly personal religious experience intending Mass, and it backfired to some extent in the Catholic press. But it's just one of those examples of contemporary practices. But Joe Biden's campaign was not immune from this criticism. This is the Team Joe app, and if you just look down the bottom of this page here, You download this app, you click on Act Now from the homepage, and then you'll be directed to your list of contacts that match the campaign's targets. Pick a person that you'd like to reach out to, press the send text button, and there you'll be redirected where a script text will populate, and they've automatically retext. This is a practice called relational organizing. It is based on the assumption that the organic nature of social media today and digital communications allows individuals to then communicate with their own networks, their own friends, their own contacts, and that could have a far more important effect, a better effect on voter turnout than if the message was just coming directly from the campaign. The other thing that we've seen is a huge use of Facebook for advertising. The pandemic produced, of course, a premium on the use of social media for reaching out to supporters, and the use of the lookalike audience or customized audience function on Facebook. Now, this has been used in many countries for a very long time. But billions and billions of dollars was spent by both Republicans and Democrats on Facebook advertising in using the customized audience function, uploading a list of existing customers, voters, supporters, etc., from which Facebook could then construct lookalike audiences to deliver targeted advertisements. And installing Facebook pixels on websites, which once clicked on, then also produced a trove of information about that individual if they haven't been careful in setting their privacy preferences properly. It is not just about the technology. It is not just about the technology. I and one of my graduate students wrote a report for the Information Commissioner last year, which was delivered to the Global Privacy Assembly last fall. That's the Assembly of International Data Protection Regulators. And what we tried to do there was to look at the range of both legal, political, and cultural factors in different societies that would facilitate that kind of political micro-targeting. So it's all very well to have the technology, it's all very well to have the companies, it's all very well to have Facebook, our WhatsApp, but those techniques have to be used within a complex set of legal, political, and cultural conditions. Constitutional provisions on freedom of speech and communication. Statutory provisions, not just on privacy and data protection, but also election law, campaign financing law. Telemarketing rules, anti-spam rules, election advertising codes. I know there's a new one in Brazil. But also political variables. I do believe, and I've argued in my article, that these practices are also facilitated or constrained by the nature of the party system or the nature of the electoral system. Whether, for example, there's mandatory or non-mandatory voting, whether there are primary elections. These practices are prevalent in the United States because of primary elections to a large extent, whether there are referendums. And then finally, cultural variables, the general acceptability of direct candidate-to-voter campaigning. In many countries, that is considered totally acceptable, totally natural, and expected. It is in Canada. In many others, it is not. In many other countries, the prospect of a candidate coming to your door and knocking on your door and saying, "Hello, would you please vote for me?" would be considered somewhat frightening. So there are those cultural beliefs, the legacies of authoritarian rule, therefore, and basic trust in political elites. So we have to get, I think, about a better sense of how all of those factors contribute to the particular practices that are seen in different countries, including Brazil. Excuse me. When we think about actually regulating these practices, however, and when we think about what we do about them in different countries, and this goes to my final set of points about the lessons and the role for regulators and advocates, it's all very well to talk about politics in campaigns, but what do we actually mean by a political campaign? In most countries, there's a particular point at which an election campaign starts, and that's a legal point when the legislature ends and a new one begins. But political campaigns are permanent. When do they start and end? Voter surveillance is a global phenomenon requiring a high degree of international harmonization. The global tools that we have to address these issues are limited, to be honest. Some of them are voluntary. Some of them, like the General Data Protection Regulation, are driven somewhat coercively by the European Union and the Commission and for commercial interests. There's a large, secret and shifting ecosystem of global actors, controllers, processors within this political influence industry. They're somewhat opaque. They're dynamic. Companies come and go with extraordinary rapidity in this space. So it is very difficult to understand what actors are active in particular countries. And it has to be said also that the interests on the other side of the debate can be compelling. The need for democratic engagement and mobilization. Unlike, therefore, when we're debating privacy in the corporate arena, where the interest on the other side is the profit motive, or when we're debating privacy in terms of law enforcement or security, when the interests are national security, internal security, here the interest on the other side is in fact democracy, is getting people to engage, is mobilizing people. Now, that, as I've argued, can produce some very, very doubtful practices. But the balance to be struck in globally and in individual societies is a somewhat different one. And it requires us to think about how we can harness these technologies for democratic engagement rather than from the opposite. It's also very difficult to convince politicians to regulate themselves. Those people who are winning elections have done so as a result of the use of these techniques. And they will not voluntarily surrender those techniques when they get in office. That is a perennial problem. But today's government can be tomorrow's opposition. And so, we have to see exactly how we can develop a level playing field and some agreement about what's our consistent practices and what are not. Also, there are different regulatory authorities in this space. There are data protection agencies, privacy commissioners, but there are also elections regulators. There are also telecommunications regulators. There are many legal, institutional, and cultural factors that affect the processing here. So it is a challenge, and it requires a high degree of political cooperation. So the lessons, I think, are as follows. I believe I'm coming to the end of my time. Let me just check the chat. Yeah, thank you. I've got a bit more time to just summarize here. There's a need, therefore, for those people who are interested in privacy to understand the increasingly complex political campaigning network in their respective societies. And I think that each group, each set of regulators in their respective societies needs to keep a handle on the practices that they see their parties engaging in, their candidates engaging in, and keep track of how that is progressing. Need to grasp the different regulatory conditions that permit or prohibit the processing of personal data for the purposes of democratic engagement. And that includes rules for campaign financing. That includes rules for transparency of ads. there's a need to cooperate with or challenge relevant regulators, including elections and telecommunications regulators where possible. It is not just privacy commissioners, data protection authorities that have this role. There's a variety of regulators. There's leverage that is possible through global initiatives against fake news. And so the various proposals for ad transparency, for example, although they are limited, and although instruments such as the Facebook ad archive give a very limited glimpse into the way that ads are being promoted, it does provide us with some insights into the extent of micro-targeting in different countries. We've been looking at the use of the Facebook ad archive in Canada to understand the extent of micro-targeting that is going on Facebook, where it's going on, who's paying for it, what kind of initiatives there are. And so those opportunities, those pressures for more transparency also allow us to think and clarify a little bit more about where bad practices concerning surveillance are being witnessed. There's also an opportunity to work within political parties. Many people who are privacy advocates, who believe in personal privacy, are members of political parties. And there's therefore opportunities to work within these organizations in the detailed and practical work of data protection and security implementation. I often say that no political party wants to have a massive data breach, particularly not in an election. So to some extent, it is in the interests of our political actors and our political parties to make sure that they're keeping that information secure and that they're not suffering enormous data breaches. And then finally, there is a need for international collaboration through regional associations, as well as the broader network of privacy advocates and experts. So, in conclusion, this is a very high-level talk, and I'm certainly willing to get down to some details in the question and answer session. Familiar questions about privacy, about the transparency of processing, about the fairness of processing, about consent, about security, about accountability, are now at the center of an international debate about democracy and the future of democracy and the nature of democracy in digital conditions, digital world. And advocates and regulators now find themselves at the center of this global conversation. To the extent that personal data can be appropriately protected in the regulatory context, to the extent that instruments like the General Data Protection Regulation and the new Brazilian Data Protection Act can be used in order to ensure that basic privacy principles on transparency, fair processing, consent, security, accountability can be applied to political parties and the candidates that work within them, then we also have an opportunity to tackle and to understand the not only privacy, but also the larger problem about misinformation and fake news. I also think that elected officials the world over have gradually come to realize that the inappropriate processing of personal data can win elections, but it can also allow them to lose elections. It can hurt them where it hurts most, at the ballot box, in other words. And so what I'd like to argue to you is that unlike in the past, where privacy, data protection have been critically important issues, but have rarely been seen as big P political questions. I don't know how that translates into Portuguese, but I hope you know what I mean. Big political questions over which politicians can win and lose votes. I think that's a critical transition. I think it's a critical point at which we in the privacy community and those people who are studying these issues now see a different world where the study of privacy, the study of data protection is now at the center of the larger question about how the digital platform economy is going to look in the future, and therefore how our democracy is going to look. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I have a Brazilian graduate student who kindly translated that for me. Thank you so much. I very much look forward to your questions.
Muito obrigado, Colin. Nós temos aqui já algumas perguntas muito interessantes e eu vou, na minha condição de moderador, já aproveitar para me aproveitar da minha condição e colocar questões minhas também. Eu vou fazer o seguinte,
okay.
até para ir esquentando o pessoal que está acompanhando no chat, eu vou fazer uma pergunta por vez, e depois, se elas se acumularem, a gente faz em bloco, mas vou fazer uma por vez. Então, uma primeira pergunta que vem aqui do pessoal do chat tem a ver com as grandes plataformas. Qual a responsabilidade social, política, moral e econômica das Big Techs? As Big Techs ficaram grandes demais para enfrentá-las, considerando a existência da democracia digital, de modo oposto, uma ditadura digital. Como a tecnologia pode favorecer a tirania e o fortalecimento de governos autoritários? Eu queria juntar essa questão com uma questão minha, que eu achei muito interessante você apontando, a questão da transparência nos anúncios, ad transparency, e fiquei pensando na questão das plataformas mesmo. Minha pergunta é o quanto você pensa que basta a transparência dos anúncios nas plataformas, ou se nós não devemos caminhar para, e não seria necessário a gente ter também uma transparência de algoritmos. Pensando nisso que você comentou bastante bem, de uma eleição que a gente não sabe quando começa e quando termina, não é? O processo da discussão política não acontece só no período eleitoral, ele tem acontecido o tempo inteiro, e as plataformas se colocam muitas vezes nesse debate como se fossem entidades neutras na transmissão de mensagens. Mas a gente sabe que, além de entregar anúncios, elas também trabalham com seus algoritmos para dar mais... para fazer com que certos posts, certas mensagens apareçam mais do que outras, um pouco naquela ideia que tem sido muito discutida, da economia da atenção, em capturar a atenção das pessoas, e isso ser o próprio modelo de negócio das plataformas. Eu sei que estou juntando questões muito complexas aí, mas queria colocar isso para você, aproveitando a pergunta da nossa audiência, e depois a gente tem mais questões da audiência. Colin, por favor.
Well, Raphael, thank you. Those are big questions. Let me just say something about surveillance capitalism, which is, of course, the bigger issue about the role of platforms in our society more generally and where that is going. I personally don't think that the contemporary high-tech dominance of the space can be allowed to continue, but where we're going with that is, of course, up in the air. I have some hope that the new administration in the United States might be challenging the big tech companies more actively than the last one did. My focus, however, into that larger debate is to concentrate on those actors who are the buyers, if you like, the demand side, to focus on the political parties, the campaigns, the candidates, etc., who have got it into their heads, sometimes falsely, that if they just have more data than the opposition, that they can win elections. Now, there's a lot of myth about that. A lot of money is spent, a lot of money is wasted on that particular principle. Furthermore, I think one part of the key, one part of the puzzle, one part of the solution is the aggressive and a comprehensive implementation and enforcement of basic privacy principles, to the extent that the platforms can be controlled in the personal data that they process, the personal data they then use in order to micro-target advertisements, then some of the worst effects that you mentioned, both in democratic societies as well as in more authoritarian societies, might be lessened. I'm not naive enough to think that this is going to be the whole solution. But I think that we have seen initially in some countries where there's been appropriate regulation and appropriate investigation about what parties and candidates have done, and the investigation but also enforcement, then we have seen those actors reined in and the use of personal data in the electoral space being controlled. So two examples come to mind. In France, there's been some quite aggressive regulation of the use of the scraping of social media. So for example, Twitter. And the Commission nationale de l'informatique in France reached a number of rulings controlling how political parties could not use data from social media in order to engage further with the electorate. That's one example. And we just saw last week a very good audit by the Data Protection Authority in the United Kingdom, by Elizabeth Denham, on political parties in the United Kingdom. And that has produced a code of practice which the parties are signing up to, which in some respects levels the playing field. And just one final thing I'll mention, which I didn't mention in my talk. I've been doing some work for the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, trying to develop some guidance, which may be applied globally, on appropriate use of personal data in elections. And the Council of Europe Convention 108, which is consistent with the General Data Protection Regulation, I think has a potential to be a very interesting global instrument for the to address these challenges. That doesn't get to the bigger question. It doesn't get to the bigger question about the extent to which we need better ad transparency, maybe algorithmic transparency, although I'm still a little unclear about what that means. I follow those debates, but I think that you can address the demand side of the equation and control the extent to which personal data might be used by political actors. And that goes some way, I think, to controlling the worst effects of data-driven elections. I hope that addresses your question, Rafael.
Sim, sim. Mais uma pergunta aqui da audiência. O painelista professor vislumbra alguma conexão entre a vigilância dos eleitores e a constatação do Democracy Report 2020 do VDEM, da Universidade de Gothenburg, de que as autocracias são hoje maioria em 92 países? Eu acho que aí isso se junta com uma questão mais geral, né? Se todas essas transformações que a gente está acompanhando nesses últimos anos, eu acho que a gente pode pensar nas data-driven elections, nas eleições orientadas a dados, mas talvez a gente possa pensar também nas questões de desinformação nas plataformas. Se o professor vê já uma relação entre esses governos autoritários que emergiram e essas mudanças tecnológicas.
I'm sorry, Rafael, the translation was not on while you were talking. I can, but I wasn't getting a translation.
Do you want me to repeat in English? People on the translation maybe because eles me disseram que they told me that I can speak in two languages, just one. So maybe I'll address the question in English, and they can translate it to Portuguese for the audience. One question is about the emergence of autocracies in more than 92 countries. This is from a report from the University of Gothenburg. And my question is if you see some relation between things that changed in the last 10 years with this spread of misinformation and the predominance of platforms like taking control or being the intermediary in the public debates. If you see any relation with this, this emergency,
yes,
with the autocracy.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a very good point. I mean, we've seen on all measures of democracy, we've seen a decline. I mean, there was post the end of the Cold War an increase in the number of countries that could be seen as democracy. That has leveled off, and there's been a decline. Measures of democracy in other countries, including the United States, has gone down. And so there's no doubt in my mind that is to some extent. There are other trends at work as well. That has been exacerbated by the widespread use of digital platforms for the communication of personal information and the use of propaganda. There's no question about that, and it has happened very rapidly, I think, and I think people are just waking up to this. I don't think that it's the only cause, however. I don't think technology is the only cause. I don't think the digital platforms are the only cause. I think they're exacerbating or aggravating trends that have been in existence for a very long time. Polarization, partisanship. But I do think that the unregulated use of social media platforms for political communication has exacerbated those trends. And I think we're seeing those not only in societies which have had autocratic traditions, authoritarian traditions, but to some extent also in more established democratic countries, including my own. Including my own. We saw in the 2019 election some really disgusting racist ads being perpetrated on Facebook, and they were there. They were there relatively briefly, but the damage had been done. Okay, so I agree with you, but again. My central argument, I think, is that, the world of privacy protection, the world of data protection, the world of anti-surveillance, seeing this as a surveillance problem, right? Seeing voter surveillance as a distinct problem in the same way that we think about consumer surveillance or criminal surveillance or other forms of surveillance is part of the solution to this issue.
Excelente. Eu tenho mais questões aqui da audiência que talvez tenham uma conexão com isso que você finalizou sobre a questão da vigilância. E eu acho que tem a ver com... acho que tem uma relação com isso. A pergunta é se você considera que aqui a pessoa cita diretamente a Lei Brasileira de Proteção de Dados, mas talvez a pergunta possa ser expandida para as leis de proteção de dados globais, se elas podem mitigar impactos negativos dessas eleições baseadas em dados. E uma outra pergunta que se relaciona com isso é, além dos fatores que permitem microdirecionamento em campanhas políticas, quais seriam as restrições democráticas para isso? A regulamentação da proteção de dados pode abordar suficientemente todas as questões democráticas?
To answer the second question first, no, that's not possible, and I'm not arguing that. I think the way that our data protection laws have been constructed over the years are, generally speaking, too narrow to deal with the larger problem. I'm just arguing that it is a critical part of the solution. And so to get onto the GDPR, there are some very, very strong provisions in the GDPR, and I think also in the Brazilian Data Protection Act, about the processing of sensitive data on political opinions. Right? Political opinions is defined as a sensitive category of data in the GDPR, and also it should be in any country's law that is expected or is granted to be adequate under European rules. So in my view, the rules are there. They just need to be enforced by our regulators. And we're beginning to see that. But it's been too late, frankly. And with the exception of a few regulators in different countries, others have been slow to engage. Is the GDPR, however, the correct instrument for thinking about these issues globally? I'm not sure. The GDPR is a very complex, cumbersome, bureaucratic, European, with respect, piece of legislation. And it doesn't export very well. Okay? I have been giving some critical thought to the way that the Council of Europe's Convention 108 Plus, which is has been in the shadows of the European regulation, might be a more exportable instrument, set of principles for this particular area. One reason is that the Council of Europe is an institution that is more engaged with human rights and democracy and grew out of those traditions with the European Convention on Human Rights, and is less influenced by corporate concerns, I think. Anyway, I'm beginning to do some work on that, and there's a tomorrow actually I'm speaking at a plenary session on these issues, and so I think there'll be some efforts there. But those are excellent questions. Thank you.
Temos mais uma pergunta aqui que eu acho que vou fazer uma pequena adaptação, porque ela pergunta sobre a sua visão sobre o debate sobre soberania digital no Brasil, mas eu acho que isso, de repente, pode ser levado para uma discussão com relação à geopolítica, né, que é a segunda pergunta que emenda nessa. Discursos de políticos falam sobre a soberania do Estado, mas o Brasil ainda é muito dependente de tecnologia digital internacional. Aí eu acho que dá para a gente colocar essa questão para você num outro panorama, que é com relação à independência ou dependência de Estados com relação a tecnologias internacionais, e como você vê a questão dessa soberania do processo digital frente a ameaças de países estrangeiros. Eu acho que a gente tem algo que ficou muito conhecido, muito debatido sobre a possível interferência russa na eleição americana, mas no contexto de países como o Brasil, que não tem um domínio da tecnologia completo, nós somos muito dependentes de redes, máquinas de países estrangeiros. Então, acho que se coloca uma questão sobre interferência externa sobre eleições nacionais.
Yes, thank you very much. I can't really speak to the Brazilian case with any authority. But I will say something generally about the foreign interference problem in the United States. We are told from the cybersecurity experts in the Department of Health, Homeland Security, that the number of direct efforts to interfere with the US election were far, far lower than in 2016. We have to wait and see whether that is in fact the case. But the lesson I draw from that is that in protecting elections, given the complexity of elections, given the digital nature of elections, protecting the electoral process, protecting the registration process, protecting the data that the political parties have, protecting the data that the companies have that are used by political parties is an enormous exercise and a very, very expensive exercise. So, and I know this is the case in Canada as well. So it may be that in 2020 they were successful in protecting the election infrastructure and that there were very few, at least successful efforts at foreign interference. But going forward, I think that means that our elections are going to have to spend a lot of money on ensuring that this doesn't happen again. That's point number one. Point number two, on issues of data sovereignty. One of the things that I think we might see, and I think this might be a good solution in my country, is for there to be a separate political advertising platform, which the government can establish and which can be controlled, and which allow then political parties to in fact engage with the electorate outside of the platforms of big tech. Now, I mean, that is not going to allow them to reach so many people, obviously, but it is something that has been debated. It's part of the larger question about data sovereignty, all of which, of course, is included and implicated in the larger issues about trade and the larger issues about the protection of personal data in our trading agreements with the United States in the Pacific and also with Latin America. Very good question. Thank you.
Temos uma questão aqui um pouco mais filosófica. Stefano Rodotà fala que com as novas tecnologias foi possível fragmentar o corpo da pessoa. O corpo virtual ou digital pode corresponder ao corpo humano? Como garantimos a dignidade a esse corpo? Eu acho que isso talvez se liga àquilo que você nos mostrou na tua apresentação sobre o Facebook e as tentativas de usar exemplos de certos corpos para informar um direcionamento de dados.
Yes, Professor Rodotà, hello. I think that this is where we see some direct consequences for the issues of democratic competition, right? And I mentioned two things. One, that the self-correction of the discourse, the democratic marketplace of ideas is weakened. If some people are only seeing some messages and they cannot be corrected, other people are seeing other messages which are curated, then that produces not a democratic debate, not an engagement across divisive lines, but it produces something a lot weaker. Secondly, I believe that digital campaigning weakens the mandates that governments have. It weakens their ability to say, we are speaking for the entire people. It means that they are saying one thing to one group of voters and another thing to another group of voters. And when it comes to govern in the public interest, which is what, winners are supposed to do, right? And not just reward the people who voted for them. it weakens their ability to claim that they have a mandate from the entire people. It weakens their ability to fashion public policy, which is fashioned in such a way to appeal to the entire public interest. It produces, in many countries, a version of what is often called clientelist politics. And I know you have a deep tradition of that in Brazil. Patron-client politics, where politicians are serving the people who are their clients rather than their citizens. And we're seeing those tendencies in other democracies as well, in Anglo-American democracies as well. It's deeply troubling. That, I think, is the consequence of the fragmentation of the digital persona, as you put it. Thank you for your question, Professor Rodotà.
A questão citava o professor Rodotà. Muito bem, temos uma última questão aqui e aí eu quero juntar uma questão minha também. Tem uma questão aqui que é sobre processos de votação. Se você considera que o processo de votação em alguns países, e talvez até pensando para além dos Estados Unidos, se você tiver essa informação, se você pensa que esse processo pode estar comprometido. E aí, junto com uma outra questão minha, que é sobre processos eletrônicos de votação em geral. No Brasil, nós temos uma urna eletrônica que é utilizada já há mais de 20 anos, recentemente, ela tem sido alvo de tentativas de desestabilização na sua credibilidade. Então, eu queria saber um pouco, queria saber um pouco sobre sua opinião geral também sobre processos eletrônicos de votação.
I'm not an expert on electronic voting systems. We have very, very low-tech voting in Canada. We take pieces of paper and we take a pencil and we put a cross by the name. And as far as I know, our elections are actually pretty secure. We have resisted electronic voting in Canada. We have mail-in voting, but we still take a piece of paper, we put a cross on it, and therefore there's an audit trail. I don't know whether that will continue. We're a smaller country, obviously, although a highly dispersed country. But what is obvious from the recent US election is the need for a paper trail. And that is what is going on in Georgia at the moment, right? And I think that is extremely important. There's been questions. There have been complaints, litigation raised across many states about the accuracy and the viability of elections in various states. Georgia said, okay, the election was close in Georgia, let's count the votes manually. And that is what they are doing. So you can have digital voting, you can have voting machines, you can have the high technology, but you have to have the paper trail in order that there can be an audit. And so that is one big lesson, I think. I do think, however, that the question about electronic voting is somewhat separate from what the issues that I've been talking about. The processes of election, the processes of how we actually get people to make choices. Now, they will be compromised in some countries, I think, but I do see that as a separate set of questions from that of evolving the secrecy of the ballot, the Australian ballot, the secrecy of the ballot and all that. It's a separate set of questions, but what we have is a tension between the secret ballot, hopefully, and the transparent voter, right? And the problem is that the amount of data that's available about people's political opinions and how they're likely to vote or not vote comes up against this tradition of secret voting, electronically or otherwise, and produces this massive tension between political parties, pollsters, consultants, etc., knowing in fact how people are going to vote, predicting how they're going to vote before they even do. Okay, that's at the heart of this larger dilemma. Thank you.
Excelente. Acho que é muito interessante essa ponte entre o segredo do processo eleitoral e o fato de que você tem exposições públicas cada vez maiores que fazem com que as tendências de votação sejam conhecidas, e inclusive daí acho que se liga com um tema nosso aqui, que é o da supressão de voto, né, do incentivo a não votar. A gente encerrou já as perguntas, e nós temos ainda, já encerramos as perguntas, então temos ainda um tempo para encerramento do painel. Aí eu pediria para o professor Collins suas considerações finais, para a gente encerrar essa sessão aí que foi acho que foi excelente, super produtiva e com muitas contribuições aí para essa semana do debate sobre privacidade.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure what else I can say by way of summary. I do think, let me just say this, I do think that the value of having regulators look at what political parties are actually doing with personal data and investigating and producing public reports on what they're doing is proven. We have, of course, the reports that were done on Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. That is extremely important. But that led in the United Kingdom and in Canada, and I think also in Australia, as well as in France, as I mentioned, so some deeper analysis and consideration about where the appropriate lines should be drawn, given the law, given the culture, given the party system, given the electoral system. And that has, I think, even though there's resistance to that, even though political parties don't want to show what they are doing to the opposition, I think over time I'm seeing a kind of recognition that, as I said, today's government will be tomorrow's opposition. And this constant demand for data cannot continue. It leads to a race to the bottom, in other words. And we've seen a race to the bottom with Cambridge Analytica and with your story in Brazil and other countries as well. I could have mentioned India, other countries. And I believe that that trend is moving in a different direction, different pace in different countries. So that there can at least be some agreement between political actors, helped by the regulators in different places, about what is appropriate use of personal data in an election and what is not. What is intrusive and what is not. What is expected and what is not. When a candidate knocks on your door, what can they collect about you? When they phone you up, what can they collect about you? When you choose to follow a candidate on Twitter, what information can be collected? And we're beginning to see a critical debate about the different mechanisms through which parties and candidates capture data on the electorate, make inferences about those people, and some detailed conversations with the various people within the political ecosystem about what the appropriate way is forward. Now that is happening in more established democratic countries and those that are principally governed by the GDPR before elsewhere. But I see that as a critical move. politicians, parties can lose votes, right? They can lose votes, they can lose elections if they see that personal data is being processed in a way that is disadvantaged to them. People are being targeted in ways that disadvantages them. There is beginning, I think, to be a recognition in some countries that that race to the bottom cannot continue. But the challenges are enormous, the barriers are enormous, and as I said, it is very, very difficult to get politicians to regulate themselves anywhere. That is a global law of politics, and I'm sure it's true in Brazil as it is in the United States and Canada. Thank you.
Bom, muito obrigado, professor Colin Bennett, por essa tarde muito inspiradora. Eu acho que para um caminho muito difícil que nós temos pela frente, como você muito bem disse, os políticos não gostam muito de regularem a si mesmos, mas eu acho que isso é extremamente importante para o processo democrático em geral, e espero que os partidos políticos tenham um envolvimento muito maior com relação a questões de tecnologia, não tratem isso só de uma maneira superficial, que às vezes tem algumas tentativas de legislação que nós temos acompanhado no Brasil, que são feitas com muito pouco conhecimento sobre o próprio funcionamento dos sistemas, que pode gerar algumas coisas desastradas, mas acho que a sua fala é um excelente chamado também para um envolvimento maior da sociedade civil com relação a essas questões, porque, de fato, é a democracia que vai sendo ameaçada, é a base da sociedade, do nosso sistema político, não é? Então, acho que são questões muito importantes aí para nós. E eu queria convidar o pessoal da audiência a permanecer por aí, não sair, porque nós temos daqui às 15:45 da tarde, temos mais um painel, a dimensão do direito à privacidade e aos dados pessoais na sociedade, com o nosso amigo Danilo Doneda como uma das pessoas que vai estar nesse painel, e eu acho que a gente tem muitos debates aí interessantes no seminário como um todo. Pessoal, então, muito obrigado, agradeço a todos, agradeço de novo ao professor Colin Bennett, espero que um dia a gente possa recebê-lo aqui no Brasil, passado essa pandemia, e pedir, então, para a audiência que daqui a 15 minutos, às 15:45, então, nós estaremos de volta com mais conversa, com mais debate e com mais reflexões muito boas e muito importantes politicamente. Obrigado, pessoal. Obrigado, professor Colin.
Thank you very much. Muito obrigado.